Hi there, in this video I want to share with you 4 elements of any great sound redesign. Now there are many things that make a sound redesign, but in this video I want to actually focus on 4 processes. It's going to be volume, panning, EQ, and reverb. Now each of these are really easy to kind of skip over and kind of shove aside, but they're actually super important to make a sound redesign or sound design sound really alive and realistic. So with that said, let's get into a project where we can actually show some real examples and how you can actually apply them in real life situations. All right, so the first process is going to be volume. And for volume, I think most of us are pretty adept with it. Most of us kind of understand that the further things are from the screen, from the character, from the camera, however it is, then the quieter it is. And of course, if it's closer, it's going to be louder. So with that said, it's kind of one that we don't really need much explanation, but let me show you a few examples where it might be a little bit different here. And by the way, each of these processes that I'm going to talk about in this video, they're applicable to linear redesigns, but actually they're also applicable to any kind of game environment where it's more dynamic gameplay. And of course, you're going to be applying them differently than you would in a linear redesign, but the principles will still be the same. So let's have a listen to it here. All right, so here is one. We have, by the way, this is from the Humble Bundle promotion that's going on. If it hasn't already been done, I'll make sure to leave a link in the description where you can get some crazy amounts of asset packs and sound packs for a crazy discount. So if you want to check it out, I'll make sure to put a link in the description. But here we go. We have a little creature. He's hard to see right here, but he's in the corner here on the screen. And he's actually going to be running towards the camera. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see. But again, just have a listen to the volume so you can see how it changes over time here. Right, so that's the first thing. You can see this kind of creature here is running. The further he is, the quieter the volume is. As he gets closer, it's a lot louder. All right, so that's kind of self-explanatory. I think most people kind of understand the concept and are able to do that themselves without any kind of explanation. But here's another example that's a little bit different. And this one is for this creature right here that's going to roar. And you'll notice that his distance from the camera, from the player, from the viewer, it doesn't actually change. But what does change is the direction of his roar. So let's have a listen and see what, so you can see what I mean. Right, and I tried to add a bit more realism in that because as the creature faces away, even though the distance is the same, the volume would not be the same because it's not directly in front of us anymore. Suddenly his voice, his face is to the side, so then the more volume would be to the side. That means the volume should drop a bit. And that's, as you can see right here, that's exactly what I did in my design here. You can see here that I drop the volume a little bit every time that he turns his head. So you can see here, right here, his head's to the side, so the volume's down. Same thing here, his head's to the other side, it's down, but it's still kind of close to us so that you can still play around with volume to have that kind of effect here. Right, so now if you play all of that in light of everything else that's going on. Right, and that's how you can play with volume just to have some more realism. And the key here is to just prioritize and balance based on, well, it depends on what you're basing it on, but usually it's based on priority, what's closer to the player, what's more important to the player or to the viewer. But that's how you would do it. All right, the second process is going to be panning. This one I'm not going to touch too much on again because it's kind of self-evident, self-obvious. If something's to the left, you move it to the left. If it's to the right, you move it to the right. And based on where it is on the screen, you move it left or right over time. Especially if it changes or moves, you move it that sound source with where it is. So that's pretty self-explanatory. That's panning. All right, the next one is going to be EQ. And EQ is interesting because what it actually does is it can help you to give distance to a sound or if there's any kind of obstruction to a sound. So let's say you have a sound and let's say it's a gunshot that's distant, but you are the character and you're hiding behind a rock. So there's a rock between you and the gunshot that's distant. So having kind of an EQ there can help, especially like a high shelf, can help to make the sound feel distant while also feel like it's behind an object. So that's EQ. If I show you an example here, it's a little bit different, but let's have a listen to what we have here. All right, so here's a different redesign. This is one I did from the game Warframe, just a short design here. And here we have this ambience. And it's meant to come from like a fan or a light that's on this side over here. And the way that I'm actually bringing it in and out is not by volume. It is by the EQ. And you can see that here. I'm using an EQ here to kind of bring it in and out. So if we play it now, you'll see this kind of change over time. Right, so that's how I bring in the sound with an EQ. So that's another way that you can play around with distance is with an EQ. Usually I use either a low cut or a shelf to cut out some of the highs. Sorry, a high cut or a high shelf to cut out some of the highs so that, yeah, it feels more distance. And that's how you can use an EQ and in this case like this. All right, the fourth one, and this is the one I think a lot of beginners especially kind of skip over or just do a really simple version of it, but there's so much more that you can do, and that is with reverb. So let me show you how you can really use reverb, how complex it can be inside of a project. All right, so here I have reverb, and if we have a quick look at this redesign here, I'm just gonna play the footsteps and just have it listen to it with the footsteps, with the reverb and everything in it. All right, so one of the things that's really important when you're doing kind of linear redesigns, this applies as well for game designs, is that every environment is going to have its own reverb, right? It's going to have its own reverb setting, its own reverb feel and sound to it. So that's what you have to do inside of a linear redesign as well. So for example, in this linear redesign, we have this cabin inside here where you have your computers. If I go a little further here, we have this other kind of bigger hall area. We have the corridor here when he walks through the corridor. And then we have another kind of open area here, right before he goes into the corridor, and then another kind of cabin area, right? So there's like 3 or 4 different ones that you can have. Here, I have 4 set up, but I really was only kind of using 3. And there's a few things that you want to set up with reverb. One, I like to set up my reverbs as sends. So if you look up here, you'll see my reverbs are actually on their own tracks up here. You have here 1, 2, 3. They're not in order there, but you have 3, 2, 1, 4. Right? Those are all my 4 different reverbs for my 4 different areas. And then what I do is I just send the group. So in this case, my footsteps up to the reverb that I want. In this case, I want it in all of them because they're going to be passing through all of those areas, all of those rooms. And then the next thing that you want to kind of be aware of is that now that you have your footstep, you have your sound source footsteps, you also have your reverb footsteps. So now you have kind of like 2 sound sources, and you have to separate. You have to kind of process those as 2 different things. So you have to think about like, well, when I have my footsteps here, I play with volume, I play with panning, and I play with how I balance those out over time. You have to do the exact same thing up here. So even with your reverb, you can also play with panning. And if I show you exactly what I did, you can see here, I did some of the panning as well. So reverb is not just a static thing. It's not just something you put on and slap on a sound and then you call it done. Actually, reverb changes over time. So here you can see I have my different reverbs coming in and out over time. And you'll see there's not a perfect crossfade, and they don't come out in and out exactly. Sometimes you'll have a bit of a tail of the reverb of one room over the other. As you can see here, when he's in this corridor, still the sound of the bigger hall over here is slowly creeping in. Even though he's still in the corridor, you can still hear it, right? And same thing when he comes out of it, you still hear it even though he's part of this corridor, and then you'll also hear the next one kind of slowly coming in up here, right? So each of the rooms kind of intersect with each other, but they're not overbalancing everything. Now, in terms of setup, one of the things like I mentioned before, I like to send them as sends, and the way that I like to send them is as sends as a pre-fader post effect. And the reason why I do that is that now I can actually turn down the volume of my footsteps, so I don't actually hear the footsteps here. All I'm going to hear is my reverb. And now what I can do is I can actually evaluate to see how the rooms and the sound just as it is. So if we play just the reverb sound now, it should sound like this. Right? So you can clearly hear what the reverb is doing and how it's being affected. And you can only really do that if you put it as a pre-fader. What that means is basically you're going to send a version of the sound to the reverb before the fader. So that way, that even though you move it and change the fader, it's still going to be sent over. If you do post fader, that means after the fader. That means if you bring the fader down, that means you're also going to be bringing down the reverb sound. Now, for our instance, I don't like to do that because I like to be able to hear both separately and to be able to process them both separately as its own entity, as their own sources. So as you heard when I played it through, the actual footsteps themselves, the original sound sources, they actually don't change very much over time. The volume stays pretty consistent across the entire clip. But what is very dynamic and what does change over time is the reverb. The reverb changes a lot and it's never quite the same. And I didn't show this, but if I show also one of the reverbs that I had up here, I actually had a Haas effect. This was for the hall here because I want it to sound like it's bouncing off of one wall closer to the other. So the reason why I was doing that is because inside of here, you actually have like 2 corridors here, and I want it to sound like the sound on the off those walls is coming back to the player a lot quicker than the sound that's coming down this corridor is coming back. So again, a Haas effect is just one of those effects that you can add in if you want to a reverb. Of course, you can add other effects to reverb, like an EQ. That's a very common one. You can add even saturation and any other kind of effect, really. But yeah, there's so many things you can do with reverb, and actually it can take a long time to really to get the exact right sound. All right, so if you are kind of in the habit of just slapping on a reverb and then putting it through a send, but not really playing around with anything else, I really want to challenge you in your next redesign or next sound design task or job that you have to be a bit more intentional with your reverb and how you're going to use it. Think about the panning. Think about how it's going to be reflecting off of surfaces. Think about the balance between the reverb and the original sound source. How does it change over time? How's the reverb going to change over time? And I think if you do that, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with how much more interesting your sound can be if you do that. Now, there is another video that if you haven't seen yet, I think you'd be interested in seeing, and that is the 3 sound redesign mistakes that beginners make. And in that video, I actually talk about how reverb is one of those mistakes. So if you want to up your reverb game, I highly suggest checking that video out. And if not, I think that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end. Bye.